Hey everybody, welcome to Coffee and Open Source, a great place where we can talk about awesome things in the open source community, learn a little bit, and have some fun while we're doing it. So I have my coffee today ready and a broken hand. So I just want to introduce and get started. So let's go ahead and meet our guest today, Hayden Barnes. You want to say hello, Hayden?
Hey, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for you to be here too because if people don't know, on Twitter, you are everybody's favorite. Well, I phrased it very, very good on Twitter. You're every Windows person's Linux guy, and you're every Linux person's Windows guy. The first question that I need to ask you is, which community is nicer to you? And you can be honest. Nobody listens. Nobody watches this anyway, so you can just.
So, I find both communities very interesting, dynamic, diverse. There are certainly toxic people and kind of trends everywhere. I really appreciate how welcoming both communities are, particularly given some of that long history between the Microsoft community and Linux. So I've been very pleasantly surprised, and I kind of enjoy being this ambassador between the two communities and um, helping to bridge those gaps, particularly as Microsoft spends more time in Linux and the Linux community starts to adopt more Linux tools and the Linux community adopts more Microsoft tools and services, things like GitHub and things like that. It's really interesting time to be on the border of these two things.
Definitely. Thanks for that. So I definitely want to talk about WSL, talk about WSL Conf, talk about all sorts of fun stuff. But I kind of jumped right into it. Do you want to maybe give like a little quick interview, or not interview, but an introduction to who you are and what you do, and intro yourself, my friend.
Sure. So my current job is I'm engineering manager for Ubuntu on WSL at Canonical. Long title. I used to be a developer advocate, um, and recently made the transition to engineering manager, where I lead up the team, basically creating and promoting the Ubuntu on WSL image that you install through the Microsoft Store or from Ubuntu.com. My funny enough, my uh, background is not necessarily professionally in tech. I've long been a tech enthusiast, a Linux user since the late 90s. Um, I only periodically pursued it professionally. I actually worked for Apple for a short time, and ended up going to law school and practicing law for a while, doing business and tech law. And I I kind of burnt out on the law, and I was really keen on making a transition back to tech. Um, I know there's a lot of people who, professionally, in tech community professionally, they say, oh, there's issues here. Um, and there are, issues professionally in the tech community, but it's nothing compared to the issues in the legal community. There's some really toxic people there. And honestly, I just wanted to have a little bit more fun and do something that I found a little more interesting, besides, the just arguing over a lot of cases divorces, right?
Sure.
So,
I
um,
Yeah.
so what happened was I had all these little side open source projects all along, right? Little things that I put out on GitHub and volunteered with uh, open source communities, doing docs, doing testing that I'd always done as a hobby. And I've always been particularly keen on bringing people into the fold, kind of teaching them the skills, getting that first introduction to Linux so they can start to tinker and kind of do what I did. And a few years ago, I had the idea. I was very much in the Apple ecosystem at the time, and I had the idea for basically a terminal for iOS. And there's SSH apps and there's things like
Sure.
that. But what I
Yep.
wanted to do was a terminal environment that was similar to apps like Pythonista, which is like a self-contained Python implementation
Yes.
on the iPad that lets you automate all kinds of nifty things. I'm like, well, I want to do that, but I don't want to have to learn Python. I just want to use Bash.
Sure.
So I had this idea, and there were some people doing some similar things, and I'm like, okay, maybe there's something here that we could work on and maybe commercialize and make a product, because I didn't just want a one and done product. I actually wanted to make it something that was sustainable and viable over the long term. And iOS, basically because of its lockdown nature, wasn't really an option. So I started looking around, and I'd heard about this WSL thing. I had installed Windows in a VM on my Mac and tried it, and I was like, okay. But I kept having so then I installed Windows. I just installed Windows on the ThinkPad and started using WSL, and I really liked it. The problem was I kept having to do the same hacks over again to get exactly what I wanted working. And I'm like, well, I'm doing this. I'm on forums. I'm talking to other WSL users. They're having to do the same exact hacks. What if we made this easier? What if we made a distro for WSL that had all of this stuff baked in?
Sure.
And had the stuff that was easy to turn on, stuff that you could just turn on in a menu that would just work. So that's when we came up with the idea of Pengwin. And we talked to Microsoft, and we were like, we want to put a new distro in the store. And they said, great. And we said, we want to charge for it. We want to put a price on it. And they're like, okay. No, really, it was fine.
Really?
There's other open source applications for sale in the Microsoft store.
For sure.
And it wasn't, I expected a long, back and forth, but they checked with legal, and they were like, yeah, that's fine. That's within, the GPL. So we launched, it had a code name first, but then it became Pengwin.
Mm-hmm.
And Pengwin, it was a Debian, is a Debian-based distro. And it came with a lot of settings that were like very unique to WSL out of the box.
Yeah.
And I was hating my lawyer job at the time, just hating it. And I would go home in the evenings and then work on Pengwin. And then we started attracting enough attention and enough people started buying it that I started cutting my hours back at work. And then finally I got to just quit. It was great. I encourage it, quitting when the time is right. And I was able to hire some other devs, and we worked on it. We were worldwide, and we worked on it remotely, which kind of prepared me to later work at Canonical, because the goal of Pengwin was that we felt the other distros weren't taking WSL seriously enough.
Sure.
And after we had some success with Pengwin,
Canonical
was like, oh, we should start taking this more seriously. So we were right. We caught their attention, and some of the crew stayed back, and they continued to run Pengwin. And a couple of us made the transition over to Canonical. Myself, also Patrick Wu, and now we lead up WSL efforts at Canonical, which is very exciting. I've been here almost a year now.
Okay.
And it's been a very interesting year.
Oh, I bet. There's a ton to unravel there. I really appreciate that. First thing that I will say is that I think a lot of people are probably glad that you switched from law to engineering. It's funny because I have this like sick fascination with the law. Like business law was like my favorite class in college for whatever reason. I don't really know why. But yeah, I could understand kind of the monotony of, each case is different, but they all have a very similar framework, right? Probably very similar to a lot of tech jobs if you really think about it. Um, but I do want to call out a couple. So you have some fans here. So podcast Ubuntu Portugal is here, as well as WSL Corsair. Like they're
Ah,
here, they're saying hello. And one of the things that you mentioned was Penguin, right? Which, if for the folks that are watching right now or watching in the future, like it's in the store. I don't remember what it was when I bought it, but I bought it. It's actually my default distro for WSL, just because one setup is super easy. Like everything, I had to do. I always have to do really really weird stuff in Ubuntu or Debian when I try to get them working. Um, but Penguin was just like out of the box. You know, exports were like already populated. Like it was obviously like you said, written with WSL in mind. And it's very telling, like you said, that a lot of the other distros were like, oh, okay, well maybe we should do similar things. So kudos to you. And I think I actually got it when it was W Linux. I'm not 100% sure, before it got renamed. Um, but Penguin is fun too. Penguin is fun too.
yeah, I'll never be able to spell penguin correctly again because
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
penguin, WIN. Um, yep, Penguin was a lot of fun. Ubuntu has a slightly different approach, whereas with Penguin, you get a bespoke WSL distro.
Yes.
On Ubuntu, you get the same image you would get if you installed Ubuntu Server. So the
Yeah.
slightly different approach where, particularly for developers, we want the Ubuntu WSL image to be the same thing you would get if you were deploying to a Azure VM.
Okay.
That being said, we are working on a new out-of-box experience that will be shipping in the next month or so. We're going to be unveiling an insiders program for Ubuntu on WSL.
Oh,
Um,
that's very
yes,
exciting. That's very exciting.
where we're going to be testing the new out-of-box experience on first on the new Ubuntu 2010 Groovy, getting feedback on that.
Hmm.
It'll be we normally don't release, we only release the major LTS releases on Ubuntu, like
Yeah.
1804, 2004. This is the first time we'll be releasing an interim release. It'll be in that insiders
Hmm.
image. And then once we get testing and feedback on that, we'll be backporting it to the main 2004 experience for the rest of the users. So we're bringing some of that refinement back, some of that ease of use from Penguin to Ubuntu, but we have to do it like we would Ubuntu. So, for
Yeah.
example, the out-of-box experience uses the same visual libraries as Ubuntu Server installer. So, if you've ever installed Ubuntu Server, you're going to feel right at home. Converse, if you have installed Ubuntu on WSL, you're going to be familiar with the user interface and experience of when you install server. So we're starting to see more and more of those. So we Penguin is Penguin, and its experience, and then we want to make Ubuntu on WSL very much an Ubuntu experience.
Interesting. Sorry, I had to switch scenes and it froze on me. So that's very interesting. So I had a question about that insider program, right? So as a lifelong Windows person, don't judge me. The insider program for Windows is very interesting because it's like a sign up push to you experience, right? Are you expecting the Ubuntu insiders version to be something similar, or is it just going to be a distro that you can download, like basically through the Ubuntu downloads portal, and then you would get like a separate channel of package updates? Or is it something that you can sign up for once you have Ubuntu installed and you can disconnect from it, reconnect from it?
It'll be a separate app in the store.
Okay.
just like Ubuntu is now. And it probably won't be publicly searchable. You'll have to go to our webpage to find it,
Okay.
and then specifically seek it out. And then once you get it, it won't necessarily. There may be some A/B testing involved.
I
So
see.
you might initially, if you download it once, you might get 2010. But a few weeks later, as we're preparing to backport, if you reset the app and download it again or download it again, you might actually then get 2004.
I
So
see.
it's very much a, uh, a a box for us to test different builds in,
Hmm.
and it's explicitly for testing purposes, not for production.
Sure.
Now, if you do want to use like an interim release of Ubuntu for production, those aren't in the store, but they are available on Ubuntu Cloud Image Server. So you can download those root file systems and install them from the command line with wsl.exe --import. So we do have stable interim releases still available, but this insider image will be for us to push new things. There may be PPAs added there for us to rapidly iterate on what we're pushing there, and we want bug reports. That's what we're looking for.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So with that, then I'm curious as to what's the target audience? Is the target audience like your powered WSL users that are is and I apologize if this is going to come off wrong. Is the goal to take some of the audience from Penguin because of the bespoke nature of WSL, or is the goal to um, I guess just give people more customability out of box instead of having to, like, for instance, in the past would have a script basically that I would run whenever I set up a new Ubuntu distro, right, in
Mhm.
WSL. Like, I would just run that script and I would do basically like all the port forwardings and all the weirdness that you have to do that Penguin did out of box, right? Or did out of box if you went through the Penguin wizard, right? So similar thing, different thing.
Not quite the same. There'll be a few settings you can tweak, but it's a different engineering challenge. So
Sure.
where when we launched Penguin, we started with a few thousand users. Um, at Ubuntu, we have several million. So we have to we can't. It's kind of we find ourselves in the situation that Microsoft finds themselves in, where you have so many
Yeah.
users, you can't necessarily move as fast and break things as often as you might normally do in a smaller
Sure.
project.
Yeah.
So these things have to be incremental, slower. Um, they can't. Some of those first days at W Linux, which became Penguin, sometimes we would just break things, and like we would get a report, and like we'd have to patch it just like right then and there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you scale up to a massive project, the way Ubuntu on WSL is, we have to be much more um, strategic. So
Yeah.
things like uh, Kali on WSL now has a really great GUI interface.
Hmm.
It basically uses a built-in VNC server and a VNC client, and it's really nifty. It lets you run more of those Kali hacking tools
Yeah.
on an XFCE desktop. That's awesome. But in terms of being able to scale that to millions of users, it, we just made the strategic decision to hold off and instead support the official GUI app support that's coming later in
I see.
WSL.
I see.
So when you so so the advantage when we came to Canonical was we got more resources. We got an organization that can sponsor us, you know, uh, pay salaries, that kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
thing. But the trade-off is that we have to work within an existing structure
Hmm.
and can't break as many people's computers as we had before.
Yeah. Like, backwards compatibility is now a problem, right? Like, when you're a startup or when you're building something fresh, like, you can build fast and you're smallish user base just have to deal, right? Like I'd
Yeah.
imagine that if you pushed a pretty hot update to Ubuntu and it went wrong, like it would not go well, right? Like, talk about fires of all fires, right?
Right.
But it's but I love to hear that Ubuntu is looking at different ways, because I think the insider model I think is very interesting, at least from a Windows perspective. Like there are hardcore users that want access to latest bits, right? And are okay with it being buggy or flaky or whatever, right? And I think giving people the opportunity to do that in some way is really valuable, and it's good to see. Well, it's nice to see that Ubuntu is doing something similar. Um, I do like the idea, especially around the WSL crowd, because WSL, like as you well know, very very bespoke, right? Very very niche, right? Like there's the huge amount of people that use Windows, and then there's the smaller amount of people that even know what WSL is, and then the even smaller amount of people that actually use it daily, right?
Right.
Like there's a lot of people that just have WSL in their boxes because they saw their favorite tech celebrity do a blog on it or a video on it, and they installed it and they're like, cool, but I don't know anything about Linux, close, right? And then there's
Right.
developers that are like, oh, like I need to be able to test my cross-platform apps in any environment. WSL is so much more easy than setting up like an Ubuntu VM on my box and like having to SSH into it and all that other nonsense, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, super exciting. Like, and I think we can, like, one of the things that's really awesome, especially, I want to transition a little bit to just WSL in general, right? Is like you have built a community. Like a community does not you, I mean the royal you, I guess. You and the community, like the folks that are working hard, like with Penguin and Ubuntu and all the other distros, to the product team at Microsoft that kind of manages WSL. Like you built a community of folks that are like, hey, I like Linux, but I also like Windows. Like, can't I have both? Like, I think that's really, really cool. And one of the cool things that I know that you were a part of last year, or I don't even know what day it is anymore, but you worked on building WSL Conf, which was a 1 day conference just around WSL stuff. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So WSL Conf began as a in-person event that was scheduled for March 10th and 11th. Some of you may remember those days
Yeah,
this
I do.
year. And it was going to be about 200 people at Redmond campus at the reactor there. And we were just going to get together and like kind of talk about the future of the platform. But we had to cancel and we went virtual. We had about 5 days to pivot that. And we ended up getting over 2,000 attendees. So we by a factor of 10, we reached that audience. Uh, we grew that audience. And we basically, the idea was we're just going to have people show us the cool things they're doing
Yeah.
with WSL. So everything from Docker to Go to Rust to uh, InfoSec, like research type stuff. Um, and it was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted we want to hold another in person WSL Conf. We wanted to make this an annual event, but we realized it might not be till later next year.
Sure.
So we decided to hold another virtual WSL Conf. First one was about 2 days. This one was two 4 or 5 hour sessions.
Mm-hmm.
We made some changes this time. We shifted the schedule so that we could reach more of the world.
Yep.
Because we've seen huge growth in WSL, not just in the US and Europe, but increasingly in Africa, Asia. Um, so we're growing the community there and wanted to reach them. And it was great. We just wrapped last week on what we called Micro WSL Conf.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to be micro. It wasn't micro. We ended up having so many submissions and good talks
Yeah.
that it almost became another full WSL Conf. Those videos, people who may want to watch those, The raw videos are up now. We're going to be pulling those down in the next day or two and replacing them with professionally produced, edited.
Cool.
Like we'll be pulling out the glitches and cutting
Yeah,
out,
sure.
the natural audio glitches and fixing those. So we'll have and then we have all the content from last WSL Conf there too on the Celebrate
Mhm.
Ubuntu YouTube page. So you know, uh, when I landed in WSL, I could tell there was a community there. There were definitely users talking and sharing hacks, um, and I didn't do anything. I'm just a planner and I'm an organizer. So what I did was I just got those people together initially around kind of Penguin,
Sure.
but even then it went beyond that because like Callie was involved in WSL Conf. Penguin, is still involved in WSL Conf. So, Ubuntu then decided to sponsor WSL Conf. So
Yep.
we're certainly widening the circle, um, and the WSL community is growing. And I see myself there as just the facilitator. Um, I'm just persuasive enough to convince Canonical to give us money to hold the conference, and then
Sure.
I just put on the best conference I can.
I mean, so let's do some real talk, right? Um, the hardest part about doing anything is actually being the person to plan it, right?
Right.
So you're a modest person, like that's all pretty obvious, but I want to tell you right now, like the the ability to plan an event that you said 2,000 people were a part of, like that's something to be proud of. And people don't like when people talk to them like this, but like you're more than just a planner, right? Like you championed an event that people got value out of. So kudos to you.
Thank you. That's good.
Yeah.
I I also what I also enjoy doing is identifying up and comers in the community,
Yeah.
people who are doing interesting things and you know helping them to develop the skills to get noticed and
Yeah.
get picked up. In some cases, they're fine where they are. In other cases, they want to move up and or branch out. Um, and besides facilitating and making these things happen, I'm also particularly keen on developing talent
Yeah.
and of all kinds.
One of the things that you brought up something that's very interesting to me, and it's kind of a topical thing. Like one of the things that I see a lot on the interwebs these days is like I have this conversation basically with every single person that comes on this, and every person that will listen to me rant about it. But so the internet is full of echo chambers, right? Where like if you belong to a particular group, let's just take tech for example. If you belong to a particular group in tech, like it is you versus all the nonsense out there, right? Um, and like Twitter and other social media, they go back and forth about like what's the bad thing of the month or bad thing of the week or whatever. Um, and one of the things that I see a lot is there's a lot of us versus them and not as much of us and them. And I'm curious to know like when you mentioned like working with people that are new to tech and new to Linux or new to WSL, like what is the perception when they first come in, right? Like at least for me, when I was starting out in tech, I loved being a developer, don't get me wrong, but I was also in it for the money, right? So like finding job was number one. Doing what I like to do in job was lower than that, right? And then as I progressed through my career, I kind of put myself in positions where I got to do things I wanted to do. Um, but by no means did I feel like, hey, I can do this particular thing right out of the box. I was just focused on being able to make good money, be able to live comfortably, provide for the people that I care about. And I see young people, and I'm ranting here, so I apologize. I see young people, and they like we talked about this a little bit earlier, where it's like there's young people that it seems like they're not as interested in. the career piece. They're more interested in the community or the movement or whatever you want to call it, right? And I want to know what, as somebody who works with up and comers a lot, like what's your perception on all that? And I know that's a lot to unwind, so.
So you have to meet people where they are and
Sure.
recognize the different constituencies. So, I deal a lot with the WSL enthusiast community, people like
Yeah.
Nuno in the chat. And, I have to foster that. But like with WSL Conf, we then balance that with enterprise and we invite professional developers on
Yep.
and who are maintaining products that are in use
Mm-hmm.
in production. And we have to balance those. And the echo chamber is very real. And I'm kind of lucky in that because WSL is so new. Like we deal with some of the parts of the Linux community that most Linux community is very accepting, or at least
Sure.
tolerant of WSL.
Yeah.
But we deal with a tiny bit of some of the toxic side of that community.
Mm-hmm.
Not as much on the Microsoft side, but a little still there too.
Sure.
But part of having a new project is that we can kind of set our own, like we don't necessarily have as much baggage.
Yeah. Sure.
And the people who are drawn to WSL are going to be inherently open-minded because they're running Linux on Windows.
Sure, that's fair.
Which very much breaks with the traditional approach. So in that sense, we're quite lucky in the WSL community, in that we have really great developers who come over from Windows, really great developers who, from the Linux community working together. We have hobbyists, and then we have professionals, and then I'd say a lot of WSL users are somewhere in between, like you were, where they're pursuing something professionally, but they're also personally interested in.
Yeah.
So the great thing about WSL is it's what I compare it to a lot is Raspberry Pi. Like you get a Raspberry Pi, no one tells you what to do with it.
Yeah.
It's this thing. Now you can make this into your production workstation if you're a professional developer, or you want to learn, front end. Amazing, perfect. But if you want to tinker and hack and figure out how it all works, it's great for that too.
Yeah. No, that's pretty spot on. And you mentioned Raspberry Pi, and it's funny because I built a tool that I decided to make cross-platform, and I have a Raspberry Pi, and the goal of it was to put it. The reason why I wanted to be cross-platform is so I could put it on a Raspberry Pi, and I didn't want to go through the experience of remote SSHing into a Raspberry Pi to build, test, run, right? I just wanted to use it as like a production environment. So I use WSL like extensively to do debugging, right? Does this thing work on Linux in general? Not even about the processor, like I can't spoof the processor, but like does it work on Linux? And it was very, very easy. And then like again, whenever I work on this tool and I make changes to it or whatever, I just open up distro. I tested with a couple of different distros, and then I'm like, okay, do these changes work? Do these things, and like the fact that everything, like even though it's its own separate thing, and people are probably gonna hate on me, but it is still like connected to Windows, right? Like there's nothing you can do to disconnect it from Windows. So like the fact that you can, for instance, like pop a browser that's technically running in WSL, but it's a browser that you can move around in Windows, like super helpful, right?
Right.
And like WSL2 and the Docker support, like being able to run Docker inside of a Linux VM, technically not a VM, but whatever. Like Linux, it's just amazingly helpful, right? And it's just funny that you mentioned Raspberry Pi there. So I'm like, oh, I have to tell a story because I basically used WSL to build an app that was going to run on a Raspberry Pi. So I imagine I'm not the only person that's done that too.
No, that's what we want. Like that's like what does Canonical get out of this, right? What does Canonical get from publishing an image and hiring engineering talent
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
and advocates? And it's because we know you're gonna start on WSL and push to Azure, or other public clouds. You're going to push to your Raspberry Pis. Um, you're going to test and debug open source
Yeah.
apps, and it really doesn't matter where you're testing and debugging, because those
Yeah.
the patches, those bug reports are going to go upstream, and they're
Mm-hmm.
going to make a difference for everyone using Linux.
Yeah.
So that people are like, what's your game? And it's like, we just want more people using Linux.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I've always had this strange thoughts, like how any like these open source companies make money. Like I was talking to somebody who, Noelle Silver, actually, I interviewed her like a couple months ago, and she used to work at Red Hat. And I'm like, well, how does I understand in conceptually like how these open source based software companies make money. I get it, but like, how do you make enough money to be as big as say a Red Hat that gets bought for billions of dollars, or Canonical, which is like the largest, probably the most, I don't know, this is probably me making an incorrect statement, like probably the most well known like Linux distro for like
yeah,
for non Linux diehards, right?
right.
Maybe people might have other opinions on what's their distro of choice, but like more than likely not, like most people, I imagine when they get started with Linux, they get an Ubuntu distro. I'd imagine because the UI is very similar to Windows. At least it can be configured very similar to Windows, and like it's the user interface just in general is inviting for a lot of folks. That's like it was the first one that I worked on. I since played around with other ones, but I always end up going back to Ubuntu for whatever reason. I think it's probably just creature comfort. Not saying all the other distros are bad, but Ubuntu was the one that I've kind of planted my flag into.
Sure. So, I mean, if you're running desktop Linux, you're probably running Ubuntu or an Ubuntu derivative, and that the the application of design to the distro is really one of the things that set Ubuntu apart early on. That and the support, the hardware support you could get, and the free CD in the mail you could get.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, now it's in the Microsoft Store if you want it
yeah,
too. Um, so yeah, I'm really proud to be part of Ubuntu. It's a cool story to be a part of. We are very small compared to Red Hat, um, but we still accomplish a lot. One of the ways we make money um, is, we, in order to make Ubuntu well,
yeah.
we've created a whole bunch of other tools around it, and then we
Mm-hmm.
turn around and we offer those tools to other developers. Things like microkates, which is a single node Kubernetes cluster for your workstation, Juju, which is a Kubernetes orchestration platform, which you
Sure.
can then deploy to, all of which runs all of the Ubuntu and other Canonical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that we created to serve this operating system to millions of people,
Yep.
and then companies like AT&T and um, you know automakers are like, oh, we want that too. So
Yeah. No.
um,
Exactly.
the funding comes, there's donations, but a lot of the funding comes through uh, enterprise who want access to the same tools we're using to build this platform for their software. We also have strategic partnerships with companies like Google and Microsoft
Mm-hmm.
who offer Ubuntu and related services uh, through their cloud platforms. I mean,
Sure.
that's a very big part.
Yep.
Um, even companies that are designing their own IoT devices, they want to put Ubuntu Core on there,
Yeah.
um, and get that enabled. That's something we do. Uh, We also work with companies like HP, Lenovo, and Dell, where you can buy laptops that are preloaded with
Yeah.
Lenovo. So the way Ubuntu makes money is actually a lot of different ways.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's just not with the core thing, right? Like that's what's always funny about like the open source. I guess not open source in general, but like the Linux distro software industry, right? There's no money in the actual OS. I guess there is some money in the actual OS, but like most of the money is in everything else. Support. You mentioned cloud platforms. You mentioned um, like enterprise deployments, enterprise relations. Like these are all things that like you kind of know exist, but like is it real? And you mentioned donations too. I have a really hard time imagining there's like a ton of donations, but like millions of dollars a year probably or more. But like I guess at the end of the day, like there's plenty of ways. I think you were going to say this and I interrupt you, so I apologize. But there's plenty of ways to make money. It's just not the way that typical software makers make money, right? Where you sell some product that's like you're known for, and then you just get revenue on licensing or on consumption or whatever it is, right? It's very much like a intangibles. Like in order, you can sure you can use Ubuntu for free, but if you're an enterprise or even if you're somebody who's like you said a hardcore developer, like you're gonna end up paying Canonical for a lot of the stuff, right? If you want to get the full Ubuntu experience.
and a lot of enterprise have different approaches to acquiring software, and they've much longer life cycles. So one of the strategic advantages of Windows for the long time has been backwards compatibility
Mm-hmm.
and support, and that's something Microsoft did really well. I mean, the it,
I mean, for the most
well,
part,
I
yeah,
mean,
but
there were
yeah,
embedded
sure.
versions of Windows. There were embedded versions of Windows XP that just left
Oh,
support
for sure.
a
Oh, for
year
sure.
ago.
And that was tongue in cheek, right? But like, yeah, like Microsoft in general, like we care very, very much about backwards compatibility because that's what keeps the lights on, right? Like
Right.
customers in general are very slow to adopt. So,
Good. And getting to that point for Linux has been a challenge, and the fact that we've reached it is a big victory. So things like Ubuntu Advantage with extended security maintenance, like we are still servicing installs of Ubuntu 14.04, and it's because enterprise does not want to upgrade, and they, some so that when you talk about selling support, sometimes it's more than just like phone and email. It's like we want to
oh
know
yeah,
that those servers that we deployed in 2015
yeah,
are going
yeah.
to run for another 10 years because of how we acquire, do major capital expenditures. It's going to be like another 5 years before we can
Oh
upgrade
yeah.
it. It's a 2 year process, and I think that in the enthusiast community, the fact that Ubuntu continues to support, I mean, rolling releases are fun. Things like
Yeah.
Manjaro and Arch, but the there's a huge value in long-term stable releases
Oh,
that
for
that
sure.
last years for enterprise. So
Yeah.
that's a big key part of the Ubuntu value proposition. Um, and we sometimes when we talk to potential enterprise clients on WSL, some of them are telling us that they run like things with motif libraries, like just ancient
Yeah,
software.
yeah. I mean, it's not as
And we're
cool as like a dial-up modem that you have hooked up. We can show that in a little
like,
bit, but yeah.
yeah, sure. Um, so the backwards compatibility is a big factor, and Linux is just getting there.
Yeah.
Um, and things like Ubuntu Core is going to be supported out of the box for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Which Ubuntu Core is the embedded snap-based, um, like lockdown, secure Ubuntu image for
Yep.
IoT devices and automobiles and that kind of thing, automotive. Um, so that that's where a lot of the value is.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are other distros that do charge, to download an ISO.
Yeah.
not Ubuntu though.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's different models, right? But I think that the model that Ubuntu has gone with is like obviously it's been very successful, right? Um, so it's one of those things where it's like you really can't say anything negative. Like if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? Like there's probably things that Ubuntu could probably be doing better, but there's also a lot of things Ubuntu could be doing worse, right? Or not worse, but different. I did want to acknowledge a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. So, um, and I think this is kind of telling, just because we were talking about a little bit earlier, but like so why do you think and this is you could just be your opinion, you don't have to be speaking as a canonical employee, but like the potential reason like major distros like they're not testing or using WSL, right? Like not just embracing it, but like just offering an option, right? Like there's lots of different Linux distros, and there's only like 5 in the Microsoft store, right? For WSL. Like, why do you think that is?
Um,
And you could
it
be
takes
honest. You can take off your canonical hat.
it takes a certain amount of out of the box thinking uh, to see the promise and opportunity of WSL. And I don't think all distros um, are there yet. I mean, you've got Debian, SUSE, um, Kali. Certainly, Kali's pushing the boundaries. They're on board, but there are some other distros that are just absent, and you know uh, it's good for Ubuntu, right?
Yeah, no, exactly, right? I think that's what the funniest thing about all of it, right, is that like I don't know what the rough number of like usable like for everyday use distros are. There lots, right? But the major ones are there, but there's still a couple of ones that are, I would like to say, pretty well known, right? I'm not going to name any of them because it's not my place, but they don't have a WSL option. And I'm always, and the fact that WSL Corsair asked this, it's very interesting to me because I'd imagine there's a, I don't know if it's a want or a need, but there's an interest in, hey, can I run distro Y in WSL instead of having to build out a VM with an image and in Windows and do basically the smoke and mirrors thing that we've been doing for a while, right? Um, but it is interesting, and for all we know, in the next 5 years, like every Linux distro will have some easy onboarding process to WSL, which I imagine probably is part of the issue too. Like the onboarding into WSL and getting into the store, like that's probably outside of the interest for a lot of companies that don't see Windows users as an audience at all. So maybe a little bit of that, maybe just it's probably not worth the energy because the user base is probably so small. Back to our comment about it being somewhat niche, right?
Well, I think some distro makers have more than enough employees to
Oh,
figure out
sure, sure, sure,
the
sure.
application process. It goes back specifically to forward thinking management and
I see.
leadership at Canonical. From the top down, they saw the opportunity of WSL, and I think that based on other conversations I've had with other distros that aren't present on the store, they do
Sure.
not have that same top down leadership and forward thinking um, for those distros on WSL. And I'm aware of other distros that aren't available.
Yeah,
And in
yeah.
fact, at Pengwin, we published some other distros when they wouldn't,
Ah, well,
derivatives of those. So,
open source is a nasty partner if you don't do nice by it, right? People just fork your stuff and do whatever they want with it.
yeah.
Um, um, but like, and I'm gonna be very pointed here, and like this is like an opinion of yours. Do you think part of it is maybe just a general distaste for Microsoft?
Um, no, well, okay. So some of the other distros that aren't present have working, very
Yeah,
strong working relationships with Microsoft. Some of them even have badged employees at Microsoft
Yes.
or badged contractors. So you can't necessarily say it's just Microsoft.
Hmm.
In fact, some of their CEOs have spoken at each other's events.
Yeah.
So I, I think it's narrower than that. I think there's specific concern around desktop and specifically the competition between Linux on the desktop and Windows on the desktop.
Hmm.
But I don't, as based on all of the metrics that we've seen, that's not really an issue. The uh, growth of WSL, of Ubuntu on WSL, tracks very closely rising growth in Ubuntu desktop and server. So I think a lot of people assume that it's a zero-sum game,
Sure.
and it's not. We get people into Linux, and then they buy a Pinebook Pro, or they buy a Raspberry, or they start spinning up more VMs, and they start contributing snap packages. So it goes back to the ability to think past that short term, oh no, are we going to cannibalize our workstation offering? The answer is no. It's just not.
Sure.
If anything, we're going to cannibalize Mac OS based on
Well,
all
that's
the
the thing too. Like and while you were talking, I was just kind of thinking that generally, right? Like, this is my personal opinion, and again, like, I can tell that you have a legal background because you're being very specific with your language, and I appreciate it a lot because I'm very a foot in the mouth kind of person. Um, but from like it would be, at least how I see it, in any Linux distro, their best interest to have a pathway to every desktop, right? Like, whether it be Mac, like there's three kinds of desktops. Let's be real. There's Mac, there's Linux, and there's Windows, right? So and the Linux to Mac path, like, that's been very well known for a long time, right? And it's only been recently with, like, I guess, like Linux VMs, but now with WSL making it substantially easier to do, like, it just makes the process substantially less convoluted. And, like, if I was said CEO of some very, very well-known Linux distro, it would be my opinion that I would like to be on every desktop, regardless of the host OS, right? And that's a very gross summarization of it. But if the goal is to get users, there's no better way to get users than to put the option of putting your OS on any host OS.
Sure, and that's why Canonical also makes multipaths, which
Yep.
is a lightweight VM that runs not only on Windows but Mac OS as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, getting on other desktops is the new sending people a free CD.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't see why that's not a bad thing either. Like, how often do we, and this is not just a distro thing, but like software in general, right? Like, you hear software is good. You download said software. You install said software, and then you make your own determination, right? That's how we consume goods now, right? Like, whether it's, the silly application that helps you zoom in when you press a hotkey, I'm gonna, like, that's one of my go-tos, or something as big as an OS, right? Like, the way that you get it is via installs via the web, and giving anybody the opportunity, like, how awesome would it be? And this is just me completely, like, 10 years from now, maybe this is a thing if we're all still alive and, like, Linux and Windows are even things. But, like, you go to said distro's website, you click a button on distro's website, and it installs that distro into WSL. Not going through the store, not doing anything else. And it doesn't have to be like a distro that's in the store. Like, for instance, It basically would be the equivalent of installing an image and installing that image into WSL, right? Like I don't know, I don't have any idea if that's an actual thing, so please nobody say, oh, I heard this is going to happen. No, but like it would be in everybody's best interest. That path to entry went from 5 or 6 to 0 or 1. You click a button and 15 minutes later you have some random distro install a WSL. I know there's a lot of technical hoops to jump through to get that to work, but like, wouldn't that make everybody happier?
Yes. And yeah, I think there's some things in the works to improve the install experience. So we'll just put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. And again, like, substantially more than me, and you're under NDA, so like that's good. But like I think that how I see it, as I'm a very novice Linux user, like don't get me wrong, like I'm in Linux maybe like 5 to 6 hours a week, in WSL 5 to 6 hours a week, and I just see that there's so much interesting things in Linux, enough for me to keep going back, because I really don't need to do any of my job in Linux, right? To be honest. But there are some things that make just life easier, like file manipulation or there's a long list of things that I'm like, this is like so much easier to do than Windows, right? And if I have access to the Windows file system, like, I mean, I'm not trying to bash PowerShell or CMD, but writing bash scripts is lovely, quite lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like,
it's okay to bash CMD. I don't think anyone owns it anymore.
I mean, but at the end of the day, like, it's still extremely used, right? Like, but I do think that there's like, and I at one point in time there was like a bash shell that you can get for Windows a long time ago. I don't know if it was a long time ago, but it was like basically like a little wrapper that like took bash commands and parsed them into whatever CMD or whatever, and that was cool. And now WSL, like I use WSL as like I don't want to do this in Windows, so I just do it in WSL pointing at the Windows file system, which is probably what a lot of people probably do. But yeah,
I mean, that's the advantage of WSL is that interoperability. If it's being able to bridge. I'll open Notepad, like I'll there'll be a file, and I'm like, okay, I need to do something else. And I'll put it in Nano, and I'll be like, okay, no, I need a little bit more. Notepad.exe file, and I'll just open it in Notepad and copy and paste in what I need to copy and paste in, instead of trying to paste it into the terminal.
Yeah, so podcast Ubuntu Portugal Cygwin, like that's exactly what I was thinking of, right? Like a Cygwin-like experience, right? I just forgot the name. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned like Nano. Like, you know how much easier my life would be if like just Nano was on Windows, like a version of Nano. Like, oh my god, like I would literally, my life would be so much easier, because the amount of times that I have to like right click open it with Notepad++ or whatever, like so much easier. Anyway, ranting again. We're running close to the end of our time, and I think that we've had a couple of really interesting discussions about things, and I feel like we could just keep talking about this, because part of the reason why I started this whole coffee and open source thing is because I like learning about things that are outside of my echo chamber. And like, even though I know enough about WSL or Linux to get myself in lots and lots of trouble, like there are people like yourself that are substantially more well-versed, and I appreciate you being able to have a conversation with me in a way that doesn't make me feel very stupid, which I sometimes have a very hard time doing. But one of the things that I think would be good for us to end on is like, what do you see like what's next for WSL? Like, obviously WSL and then WSL2. Like, do you see WSL2 as kind of the end of the line with a couple of feature adds over the next few years, or are we talking about potentially, like, do you see value in doing like a completely another rewrite, like what WSL 1 to 2 was? Or I'm curious to know, like, and obviously you don't need to talk about specifics, but like, what are your thoughts just about WSL over the next 5 years? And if that's loaded, you can step back and answer the question any way you want.
No problem. So WSL one debuted in 2016, and it got us through now. So 4 or 5 years. So that's kind of the life cycle we're looking at, I think. So WSL two as architecturally, I think is set up to take us another 4 or 5 years,
Sure.
particularly with the native kernel running. Um, there are going to be improvements in features, things like GPU compute,
Yeah.
that's insiders, GUI app, um, improvements to the installation experience, to the ability to keep distros updated.
Yeah.
Um, so, uh, you know, then come like the next set of challenges, which is, okay, we've got all these great features. How do we help enterprise deploy them
Mhm.
and maintain them in work settings? Um, and then it's you know it we're it'll be very significant where we've reached um, in terms of
You're being so careful.
the future. Well, so really, what comes next after that is kind of up to the community.
Sure. Which is a
Um,
great thing to
so
say.
the WSL team is very responsive to community concerns. So they just announced mount support, so you can now mount external file systems
Yeah.
and drives directly. And that was a huge community ask. GUI app support, huge community ask. Um, they've been responsive to requests from Docker
Hmm.
uh, for features. They've been responsive to us for features that we want to see in the future.
Yeah.
Uh, so um, I think what we're going to get to, my goal is greater feature parity with desktop Linux. I
Yeah.
want someone to be able to snap install .NET and start working on a .NET app with the in Linux
Yep.
with the Visual Studio Code remote extension, and for it to just work.
Yep.
Not have to manually configure system D, which no one should have to do.
I
Um,
mean, I love it. So funny you mentioned I was doing system D stuff yesterday for this thing that I have deployed on Raspberry Pi, and I'm just excited on how it just does not work. Like, and this is me ranting. I'll let you finish. We'll get back to what you said, but I just got to rant for a second. So like, I literally SCP'd like a .NET application, .NET Core application to a Raspberry Pi, right? And then configure systemd and all that great stuff. Start systemd, it works. Everything's working great. I restart the Pi. Systemd is running, app doesn't work. And I'm like, why doesn't this work? And I'm like going through like permissions and trying to figure everything out. And then I just stop the service, start the service, it works again. So it's like, I've just kind of given up and I'm like, okay, so now I just, instead of starting the service, I just start the process. Like, I just start the executable instead of running a service, which is a problem, but whatever. But I was just like, why doesn't this thing just work? And I don't know enough about systemd to figure out why. So I'm just like, that's it, I'm done. But anyway, I cut you off, so let's go back to what you were saying.
oh no, it's funny because you touch on a pain point I'm aware of,
Yeah.
and which is deploying .NET apps on Linux. And so that's one of the weird parts of my job, is that because I'm this contact point between Linux and Windows, between Microsoft and
Mm-hmm.
Canonical, I get a lot of other things that come across my
Yeah, yeah,
desk, like how do we get this Windows or Microsoft application for Linux snapped,
yeah.
and how do we get this working on Linux, and back and forth things. And the .NET deployment story um, is one that's come up, and something we're working on to improve with snaps, so that
Mm-hmm.
instead of uh, having to manually edit systemd unit files, you would just snap it, and your snap config file would handle the systemd unit files and all of that. So all you would have to
Interesting.
bundle is a binary and a little bit of YAML, snapcraft, let it build, and then you could even push to the Snap Store and have it automatically push
Yeah.
to your Pi without having to SCP. So, and I want to be able to do that on WSL. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
that is something we'd like to see, and so there's a lot of things that crisscross,
Yeah.
but yeah. So I think we're going, in order to do all those cool things, like bring microcates to WSL, bring
Yeah.
LexD, which is so much. Docker is great, and if you're really entrenched in Docker, it's going to be tough to switch. But if you're like learning a new
Sure.
container system,
Yeah.
LexD is so light and fast.
Yeah.
Um,
I just played around with LexD a week ago because I saw a tweet about it and I was like, okay, I don't know what this is. And I'm like, okay, so basically it's like Docker, which is like the exact wrong way to think about it, right?
right.
But like you said, played around with it. Like, oh, like I don't have to have like 400 services running to have this thing working. And super awesome. Shout out to LexD.
Yeah. So I want to be able to bring more of that other cool Linux stuff that Canonical has made or been a part of, to WSL. That's where I see the future, and that's where I want to see things go.
That's awesome. And I think one thing, just for being just a needy person, like I would love the idea of bootstrapping WSL, right? Like, and I know that you can already kind of do it, but like I would love to be able to, when I'm installing like a new WSL, I could just point basically a list of snap packages or app packages or whatever, and it just does it for me. And then periodically, like I can obviously configure this as a service, but like run, like how many times I have to do it at least once a week where I log in to my WSL instance, and then I have to app get update, app get upgrade, right? Like doing that in some time fashion, which I could easily do, but it's just something that I have to wire up myself, right? Like I think you mentioned on that a little bit, where like the updating of distros, like making that a bit more lovable. That's pretty cool. But I also really like this idea of, there was a software that I used to use a long time ago called Knight, I think is what it was. But basically, like you go to a UI, like a web UI, and you just check a bunch of softwares that you want, and then you click it, like generate or whatever, and it builds you a file. You run that file, and it would install all of those softwares on your box. Similar to like what Choco does, like if you have a Choco script or whatever, right? But that would be very interesting for like WSL stuff. Is it's like, maybe I want .NET installed out of the box. Maybe I want Docker installed out of the box. Maybe, yeah, Cloud Init support. Exactly. Exactly. Thank you, podcast. Like at the end of the day, like you folks are so much smarter than I am with this stuff, right? And I just like bridging the pieces, like is substantial, right? But yeah, like I would love the abilities, like if I want to spin up a new WSL dev environment, instead of having to create it, which takes a little bit of time, but then I got to go in there and basically run a bunch of scripts that like, okay, I need these 8 scripts to install .NET Core. I need these scripts to install Docker. I need to sudo apt-get all of these packages, right? Like, and also like there's some stuff that comes with, like for instance, Ubuntu out of the box on WSL that I'm like, I just don't need this. So let me configure like the scope of what level of Ubuntu I get, right? I don't want core, right? Because I need a little bit more than core, but I also don't need like all of the stuff that comes like in the standard base image, right? Because my install is going to be too long. So just things like that. And I know that you and Canonical and Windows and all these groups are working on probably features similar to this. But since I have the opportunity, I'm just going to say I would love something like that, please.
Message received. Stay tuned.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, so we're about 11 minutes over than what I said. Hey, can you talk till 10 Pacific? So I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me. Would love to have you on again in the future, talk about the next WSL conf. Maybe if you have some fun news to share, like you did earlier about kind of the Ubuntu Insider stuff, which was super cool. You're welcome back anytime because one, I think that you really get the idea of open source. Like, obviously, you get the idea of open source, but like, you're willing to work with community, which I think is very, very important for open source. And a lot of people that say they're open source, they really don't. So I kudos to you again. Um,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, and one thing that I like to go ahead.
No, we teased my dial-up video. We
Oh,
teased
okay.
it.
All right. If you have a few minutes for the people who want to
Yeah.
stay and watch this, so Hayden showed me something very, very fun, and I'm gonna let him take it away.
All right. So WSL 1 allows you COM port access, which means you connect old serial modems, and you can do any serial device really. But recently I was playing around and I got some equipment that allowed me to run virtual landlines in my house because I didn't actually have landlines before. And I've connected two modems to two different serial ports in WSL. And what I have here is Ubuntu 2004 and
I'm frantically sizing your window because your window looks like I got cropped it a little bit too much. So
oh,
I think
no.
we're good now. We're good now.
Cool. Let's see. And I've opened Minicom, which is a serial port utility. And this is just the kind of the nerdy stuff that I sometimes do with WSL. There we go. Initializing modem. And I can, what's the number? 8. Okay. And I'm actually calling from one WSL instance over the serial port, over the network to the other WSL instance. And I can actually answer it. Let's see if it'll answer. There it goes.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
All right, and that. All right. So there are a lot of weird, interesting, fun things you can do with WSL. Now, WSL 2 doesn't have serial port access, but it does have the new block device access with drive devices. And that's going to open. I started this project before that feature came out. That's going to open a whole new set of cool hacks and fun things to do on WSL.
So I just want to, before we keep going, I just want to be 100% clear on what just happened, right? Like, so Hayden has two WSL instances running. He has a serial port connected to his Windows machine. He is able to communicate from one WSL instance, WSL1 instance, to another using a dial-up modem that is plugged in via his serial port. Two dial-up modems. Yeah, one for receiving and one for transmitting, right? So, again, one WSL1 instance connected to a dial-up modem on a serial port, talking to another WSL1 instance connected to a different dial-up modem on a different serial port. So I know that people are like, okay, that's the silliest thing I've ever seen. Like, where's the value in that? Please explain to us what the value is in something like this.
So the value is that it was fun to do.
I see. Maybe I'll answer your question then. Maybe I'll answer my own question, unless you have like a practical example.
Well, the practical example is that lots of users are using COM port access in WSL1 to do programming of embedded devices and things like FPGA.
Yes.
And things like that. And basically, with FPGA, you can basically code custom silicon. Like if you want a RISC-V processor, like you can just flash a RISC-V processor instruction set to an FPGA or that serial port, and then switch and code for it in WSL and test it.
Yeah.
So there are practical applications.
And one thing that I think is also really practical too is that there are a lot of companies that are very dependent on serial ports because they run hardware that is only interfaced via serial ports because the hardware is very old. Like we're talking about machines that are as big as buildings, right? Like in a previous life, I had a customer that they literally they everything they writ was basically COM using serial ports to connect to these enormous devices that did all sorts of interesting things. But the value prop for those folks is that you could easily have a full developer loop locally on your machine than having to test out on the device. Right? Simple as that. Simple as that. Like closing the developer loop substantially. So instead of you having to be connected to some other enormous thing somewhere, you could basically shim something locally and do the full developer loop against it. And I think that's extremely valuable. So WSL1, like Hayden said, not WSL2 yet. Who knows? Um, but I think that there's extreme, like, it's funny because serial ports, like I haven't thought of a serial port in probably like 10 years, but the fact that you were able to find dial-up modems, like, just, I don't even want to know how you procured those things, but
eBay.
oh,
eBay.
oh, of course, I guess everything's on eBay. And they're probably like valuable for some reason. Like I imagine you probably spent more than I would expect. Like, I mean, I can't imagine because the value of them is $0. But I'd imagine. Yeah, go ahead. There's
There
collectors,
are
right?
there are a lot of fax servers that are still
Oh
using
yeah, good point.
real modems, and they're $25. Like it's not too bad.
Yeah.
Um, the problem is finding them with the manual that have the modem init string, which are the AT commands
Mm-hmm.
to configure the modem. Those can be tough to come by. But yeah, you can still buy new in-box modems on eBay. It's hilarious.
Like I had a colleague a long, long time ago that was like a procurer and collector of like vintage hardware, like not vintage, vintage, but like from the 80s, right? Where like hardware, like you could easily get it, and like it was just hilarious. Like he would like he'd have this is a RAM stick that's 8K. I'm like, oh, that's cool. He's like, no, 8K, and I live in a world where like I think the first desktop I had was like 512 of RAM, 512 megabytes of RAM. So like I don't understand the concept of memory in K, um but yeah, like his desk was just littered with all this. It looked like a junkyard, but anyway. It's good
And
to know that you can still get like quality serial devices though.
yeah, yeah, they're up there, and embedded need them. I mean, that's what they use uh, for embedded development. So
So I got one more question from the chat, and I
okay,
apologize. We've been stringing you along for a while, but
good,
uh,
good.
okay, cool. So this year has been very interesting, right? Like, not just with all of the different things that are going on in society and health and all that sort of, but it's also been a very interesting year in tech, right? Like, we're seeing companies get bought for absorbent amounts of money. We're seeing this push to do things in a particular way, which I think some would argue probably isn't the best way to do it. I'm not going to talk about particular technologies, but that's just a whole different thing. Um, but like one of the things that's very important, at least for me, and I think WSL Corsair, he was asking this probably because he had something similar, or they. I don't know if it's a he or she or they. What is the most challenging goal that you have set for yourself this year, either in tech or personally?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know,
Um,
right?
of course, it's Nuno, the Corsair, causing problems as always. Um, challenging wise, so professionally, kind of coming up. When I came from the Penguin startup,
Mm-hmm.
where basically when I made a decision, it happened, right? Like we
Yeah,
could just decide and we
yeah,
would do it. with working within a large existing structure like Canonical, and figuring out how to make those collaborations internally and externally work out well. Like,
Sure.
you can get people together and share a lot of good ideas, but then bringing them to fruition is the tough part, and that has been a challenge. And some of those are starting to pan out, bear some fruit. Some won't bear fruit that I'm aware of, at least till 2022. Some of those are
Interesting.
that long term. So making things happen, not just as a kind of an indie startup, but within the established structures, I'd say has been the biggest challenge and the thing I'm most proud of over the last 12 months. Personally, trying to keep my sanity,
Sure.
right,
Well, good luck. I think.
and maintain balance during this time um, is key. I used to work out 3-4 days a week. I can't do that the same way I used to.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and things like that. Just I'm not setting any huge personal goals this year, other than
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
get well as possible.
Yeah. I think one of the things, at least that I'm of similar ilk. Like, I live like literally down the hill, or the gym that I go to is down the hill, and they just started like letting people back in. You have to like reserve a spot, and I'm like terrified of doing that. Um, and like I used to just, okay, I'm just gonna run all the time, and I don't know if you've been following the news, but like it's the west coast of the United States is on fire, so like going outside is not possible. Like it looks like there's just a level of fog outside, which is not good. So like I've been stuck like trying to do calisthenic exercises at home, and it's very challenging to exercise at home. I imagine you probably feel a similar way. um but yeah, like staying healthy I think is very, very important, especially like mental health too. Like we can be in good health physically, like we could be able to exercise and all that sort of important things, but like if we're going to work, working 8 to 10, 11, 12 hours, whatever your typical workday is, that's maybe be unhealthy. And you're not getting any like, what's the word I'm looking for? If you're not getting like real value out of your entire day, like that's a problem, right? Especially since we can't leave the house to some extent. So one of the things that I've started to do is like meditating, like trying to be centered in some way, which is very challenging to me because I'm a bit impatient. But yeah, like I think physical and mental health, especially in 2020, is like super important. Like I worry that like we're just like when we all come out of this, whenever that is in 2022 or probably whenever, like we're all just going to be just like have like really bad Stockholm syndrome. Like
Yeah.
like everybody will say it's okay to go outside, it's okay to not wear masks, it's okay to socially gather, and people won't.
Right.
And or maybe I'll rephrase. Some people will, because there's people doing it right now, but a large amount of people won't. Be out of like I don't need to go outside anymore, and I'm worried most about the like my kids' generation, because like we're raising kids to like don't go outside, don't go outside. And when I was a kid, like I would just leave and be gone like all day and come back for dinner, and that's like the exact opposite now. So yeah,
And Zoom and webcam, and these are great streams,
yeah,
but in terms of like being our complete socialization, not enough. And because I think they have the same emotional tax in terms of outward energy,
hmm,
but they don't give much of the same like positive endorphins that you get from
yes,
actually talking to your friends in person, which is
very
why
true.
when we are going to do WSL Conf in person again, we're going to have just the best blowout.
You have no idea. I was so excited for WSL Conf. I was super excited. Like I took the day off from work.
That's
I took
awesome.
the day off from work and I told my wife I'm going to Redmond today. And she's like, you work in Bellevue. If people don't know, like Redmond is where Microsoft campus is, where the reactor is, where WSL Conf was going to be. I work in a city next over called Bellevue. Um, and I took a day off from work. I told my wife I'm going to Redmond, and she's like, "Why?" I'm like, "Because I'm going to an event, and it's going to be super fun." And then everything happened, and I watched it online. You know, kudos to you for turning a in-person conference to online in like a day, basically. But like, I was super bummed, and it just conferences in general. Like, people might know this about me, but I work on events at Microsoft, and not having events in person is kind of sad. We're still doing everything super fun with virtual events, but it's still sad, like, not seeing people super excited to get T-shirts or talk to, people they would never have an opportunity to talk to any place other than Twitter. Um, so I'm very excited for the conference world to come back. And yeah, like, if you decide to have it in Redmond, I'll be there. I will be there, and I'll expect some canonical swag and some penguins, and yeah, super excited.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll have a blowout. We can do a stream in person.
Yeah.
It'll be good.
Yeah, no, and I think that's what I'm very like, and I just keep on talking, but this is the one thing I'm interested about too. Like, what happens to this? Like, I think that in the last 6 months, like, a lot of people have turned into like production experts because they are out of their house. Like, I got a stupid green screen behind me. You got a green screen or a black screen behind you. Like, everybody got nice webcams. Like, and everybody kind of figured out like how to, I guess, nest in a way that works for them. And a lot of people start live streaming and doing all this other stuff. Like, what happens to all the stuff that we've done? Like, all of the learning that we've built up in the last 6 months, or when this stuff starts to not be needed anymore. That's what I'm very interested in. Is like, is this live streaming thing? Like, I don't think it's ever going to go away, but is it going to be like when we start going back to conferences? Who knows when that's going to happen? But when we start going back to conferences, are we going to see less interest in virtual conferences? Because I think virtual conferences are super cool when there's other alternatives as well. Like, just virtual conferences is exhausting, but yeah, like virtual conferences that you can go to as well as in-person ones. Like, I'm interested to see what happens to basically this market that just decided to show up like right at the right time, right? Like, Anyway, I work for a company that has made lots of money off of the pandemic, but I know I'm not complaining. But and again, I want to thank you so much for being here. You've enlightened me on a couple of fun things about WSL. I'm super excited to try out that Ubuntu Insider stuff. Like, I'm definitely, when that's available, like, be sure to let me know, and I'll, amplify it as much as possible. Maybe I'll do a video on it or something. And yeah, just in general, just thanks for being, a great guest. And when we finish up these interviews, I like to ask just a very simple question, and it hopefully won't be hard. If you could describe open source in one word, what would that word be?
One word. It's collaborative.
Collaborative. Yeah, there's a trend.
I caveat that even when it's competitive,
yeah,
even when you're duking it out in the marketplace with products, the benefits flow back to everyone. That's the unique advantage of open source.
Yeah, like, so we've gotten some great answers from people, like, but most people say like community or collaboration, because I think that without open source, like without community and without working together, like, there is no such thing as open source. It's just a bunch of dudes or ladies or people who don't identify as dudes or ladies, just like doing things for their own self-fulfilling interests, which is kind of lame, right? Cool. Well, excellent. Well, thank you, Hayden, for being on. For people that want to follow Hayden, it's Unix Terminal on Twitter. He's very, very vocal about all sorts WSL and Ubuntu, and also really, really good non-tech follow. I'll just say that. So, yeah. So anyway, what was that?
my bad music choices.
Oh no, 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 no. Great music choices. There are no such thing as bad music choices. Like I can put on my Spotify playlist and I can be a number one example of that. Like the worse the music, the better the music. Um,
Well, I really appreciate it, Isaac. Thank you for having me.
no worries. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in and see you next time on Coffee and Open Source.